In 1945, Korea was liberated from Japanese occupation by Soviet and American forces, and it was to become a democratic country with an elected president. But before then, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to divide their spheres of influence. Everything above the 38th parallel was controlled by the Soviet Union's military administration, and everything below was controlled by the United States military administration. This occurred on August 10, 1945. But even after Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States were still unable to agree on how to conduct elections in Korea. Each power wanted to install a government loyal to itself. Therefore, in the North, the Soviet Union built a socialist system and supported local communist leaders. Meanwhile, in the South, the United States vigorously implemented democratic institutions and supported pro-Western politicians. Ultimately, the countries failed to reach a common compromise. In 1948, presidential elections were held in the south of the peninsula under UN auspices. Thus, the Republic of Korea was born. In response, a month later, the Soviet Union established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the northern part of the peninsula. Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, was appointed its prime minister. Naturally, these were two completely different political systems. Each side considered its region the true Korea and its neighbors traitors. And in 1950, a war broke out between North and South Korea, which lasted 3 years and ended, no, not with peace, but simply with an armistice. Since then, the two Koreas have been separated by a demilitarized zone, and the countries remain at war to this day because a peace treaty between them has yet to be signed. The Korean War drove both countries into a very deep economic hole, from which they have begun to climb out in different ways. If you look at the physical map of the Korean peninsula, you'll see nothing but mountains and hills. Only a third of its territory is suitable for agriculture. While the North is fortunate in its abundance and diversity of mineral resources, South Korea isn't so fortunate. The total value of mineral resources there is estimated to be approximately 20 times less than in the North. With these resources and with the support of the Soviet Union, North Korea began building large metallurgical plants and electrifying its region. The United States, of course, couldn't allow South Korea to be worse off than North Korea. It was an ideological race that couldn't be lost. From 1954 to 1959, the United States allocated approximately $1.5 billion in subsidies to South Korea and then began large-scale privatization. Land plots were forcibly purchased from large landowners and sold to farmers at below-market prices. Now more farmers could own land, reducing social inequality. By the way, I hope you still remember Chung Ju-yong, the one whose auto repair shop was confiscated by the Japanese during the war. In 1946, when the occupation ended, he reopened the same business, as demand for auto repair in Korea had only increased after the war. And Chung had some savings and, most importantly, an understanding of how to develop such a business. He called his new company Modern, which translates into Korean as Hyundai. Korea's economy grew, and so did Chung's business. By 1950, Hyundai was not only repairing cars but also taking on any orders to rebuild damaged infrastructure, and even building barracks for 1,000 American soldiers. By the end of the Korean War, Chung's company had become the primary contractor for the Americans and was able to obtain construction equipment from them that its competitors lacked. As a result, Hyundai received the largest construction contracts from the South Korean government, but because others lacked the same experience and resources. Another businessman, Lee Byung-chul, yes, the same one who sold groceries at a store called Samsung. During the Korean War, he fled Seoul because his company's warehouses were burned by the North Korean army. But when South Korea retook Seoul, Lee Byung-chul, using his connections, gained access to government contracts for noodles, sugar, fish, and other essential goods. The thing is, Lee Byung-chul wasn't just any Korean. His father, for one, was a friend of South Korea's first president. Soon, Samsung built a sugar factory in the city of Sudong, which later grew into South Korea's largest food holding company. In 1954, Samsung opened the largest woolen fabric factory, and in 1958, for convenience, it acquired a bank and an insurance company. Yes, that's how quickly business grew in a post-war country with the right connections. Finally, Ku and Hui, the same inventor of the popular Lucky tooth powder, opened the Lucky Chemical Company after World War II, which began producing face cream. This product helped the company transform tooth powder into Korea's first toothpaste, also called Lucky. Its popularity is largely due to the fact that in 1953, Lucky placed its toothpaste not in glass or porcelain, as its competitors did, but in a plastic jar. To achieve this, Lucky Chemical opened Korea's first plastics factory, producing not only toothpaste packaging, but also soap dishes, combs, and even water pipes. You might ask, why didn't the government prevent the emergence of such monopolies? Because the country needed to rapidly develop heavy industry and technology to escape poverty. Small private firms simply couldn't compete with international companies. The Korean government saw an opportunity to rapidly develop industry not through market competition from scratch, but by supporting established businessmen who simply needed a little help. So, in 1958, the monopolist Lucky Chemical founded a company called Gold Star, which was intended to produce home appliances for the Korean domestic market to avoid the need to waste money on imported electronics. A year later, Gold Star released the first Korean radio, and a little later, the first domestic fans. By the end of the 1960s, Gold Star had produced the first domestic refrigerator, air conditioner, and even an elevator. You might ask, where did this company go? We know nothing about it. No, you see, in 1995, Gold Star and Lucky Chemical would merge to form Lucky Gold Star Corporation, or LG for short. Samsung would also enter the home appliance industry, choosing televisions as its primary niche. Meanwhile, Hyundai was building Korea's largest structures, the Soyang Dam, the expressway between Seoul and Busan, and the world's largest shipyard. Meanwhile, Hyundai transitioned from car repair to manufacturing. First, they released a car in collaboration with Ford, and a few years later, the Koreans produced their first domestic car, the Hyundai Pony. Of course, companies like Hyundai, Samsung, and later LG grew out of family clans. At a time when the country had nothing but an opportunity to corner the market, they were able to do so first, thanks to their connections and experience. Then, government funding transformed them into the country's largest businesses. These companies began to be called by a new term, Chaebol, which translates as rich family. As you'll see below, one person in such a family controls many companies that dominate entire sectors of the Korean economy. The authorities found it very convenient to work with the Chaebols. But judge for yourself, Samsung Electronics, which produces televisions, will always repay its debts because it is overseen by its parent company Samsung, which owns food production, insurance, and banking businesses. And the authorities had been working with these families for years. It was much easier to trust them than new faces. And you'll agree, it's easier to control and finance 10 companies instead of 100. In short, the Chaebols had every opportunity to grow. And they did. In 1973, their share of the country's GDP was around 10%. By the end of the 1970s, it had risen to 16%, and 10 years later, it was 33%. The final point of monopolization of the South Korean economy was the decline of American aid. In the 1960s, the United States became involved in the Vietnam War, and funding for South Korea began to decline significantly. Meanwhile, dangerous North Korea, just across the border, remained. And so, since the 1970s, South Korea has been actively producing military goods. And who could do this but the Chaebols? In fact, no one. So don't be surprised by a tank from Hyundai, or howitzers from Samsung or Kia. In short, the original plan worked. The Chaebols, thanks to their scale, technology, and cheap labor, produced cheap goods. They actively exported their products and earned foreign currency to purchase foreign technology and equipment. And South Korea's economy grew at a breakneck pace, and so a previously poor agricultural country became a center of innovation and science. However, the government's reliance on family monopolies proved a fatal mistake. And for seemingly simple decisions, there's always a price to pay. And for South Korea, that price came very quickly.